I'm a very big believer if you have a low budget, which is fine, if you're going to get help in one section, it's creating great survey questions. Because I've had a lot of people come and say, oh, I didn't ask this question correctly. Like, what do I do now? And if the surveys feel that it's honestly too late, you can't fix a broken survey. So I firmly believe to get help with your survey design.
What does it really mean to be a thought leader in B2B? That's what we're here to find out. This is the Notorious Thought Leader, a podcast for B2B marketers who want to generate demand by creating content that builds credibility and thought leadership. In each episode, Erin Balsa helps demystify thought leadership and uncovers how companies are using thought leadership to generate demand. Let's get started.
My guest today is my good friend, Michele Linn, founder at Mantis Research. Thanks for being here, Michele.
Thanks so much for having me, Erin.
Of course, I'm so happy to chat with you. So we originally connected and bonded over our shared love of conducting survey-based research and writing research reports. And for a while, we also co-led a monthly meetup for anyone that was interested in conducting survey-based research. So it only makes sense that the bulk of this conversation will focus on research reports. But for anyone listening who's not familiar with the term research reports, as it pertains to our world of B2B marketing, can you briefly explain what a research report is?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our terms, I think there's a lot of confusion when people say research. A lot of times people mean like I want to understand my audience better, or I want to, even do research to make a more effective blog post. What you and I are talking about and what you and I know do is that we really focus on creating research that you can publish that really helps you be seen as a thought leader. So how can you answer your audience's unanswered questions? How can you uncover something that's really new and meaningful so that you can help your audience think about something in a new way? And that's why research reports are really, really powerful.
Yeah, so we're talking about things like, in our world, the state of B2B marketing. So talking about trends and things that people are interested in, but it could be any industry. It could be the state of digital learning. It could be anything. And it doesn't even have to be the state of. I think a lot of people title their reports that way, but reports can really have creative titles as well. But it's important to kind of set the stage for this because one time I was invited onto an event, a digital kind of summit to talk about research reports. And half of the people that attended wanted to conduct market research to better inform their product roadmap. And it wasn't at all about publishing that research in a consumable form with the goal of building authority, attracting new customers, nurturing leads, and things like that. So just wanted to really be clear.
And one other thing to add to that too, because I've been in a really similar situation, and I've also been in situations where people hear research and they know it's to publish and they know it's, to do all those things, brand awareness and nurture and so forth. But original research can mean a lot of different things. It can be the survey-based research, which is what I know you and I know a lot about and talk about a lot. But it also could be qualitative research, where you're doing a focus group of people and pulling out trends. Or it could be research where you're looking at public databases and really trying to understand what the data means. Or it could be looking at your own user data or behavioral data to understand, what are those data trends. So there's a lot of different ways to publish research, all of them very valid, all of them good for different reasons. But I would assume today what we're talking about is just survey-based research.
To keep it simple, yes, but you're right. And in the past, I actually did repurpose some market research that my internal product team had done to inform the product roadmap. And I actually partnered with an internal data scientist to turn that into a research report that we use to get people into our funnel. So you can actually reuse the market research, like you said, use your product data once you start to get a good quantity of product data. But yes, to keep it simple for the listeners, let's focus on survey-based research today. Okay, cool. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, Michele. So, in my opinion, research reports are one of the best ways to build authority and thought leadership for your business. Speaking of thought leadership, here's the golden question of the show. In your own words, what the fuck is thought leadership?
So I think it's a really good question. And because everyone thinks about thought leadership in their own ways, to me, thought leadership is when you're saying something that's meaningful to your audience, that's inspiring action, or it's inspiring them to think differently. It's saying something new. So just not regurgitating what's out there, but really sharing something, again, just really sharing something that's going to help someone think in a different way.
One word that you just used that I haven't heard yet from any of the guests is meaningful. Why did you say meaningful?
You know what? It could be. I actually use the word meaningful a lot. I also use the term relentlessly helpful a lot. Like I believe that research should be rooted in curiosity, and I believe that it should be relentlessly helpful to your audience because I think it makes it meaningful. And I think, and maybe I've been in the content marketing space for many years. I worked for an organization called CMI for many years. So
Content
my
Marketing
world's been
Institute, for anyone who doesn't know.
sorry, Content Marketing Institute. Thanks, Erin. And one of the things I think I love content marketing, but I also got a bit burnt out on content marketing because I was doing content marketing about content marketing. And I feel like there are so many people who are just pushing out content just to get it out there or to check a box. But if we step back, I think if the content's not meaningful to someone, why you even do it? So to me, like that's just a really good lens to really figure out, is this even worth my time? Is it worth my reader's time?
Yeah, don't phone it in. Don't check a box. It has to be meaningful to matter and to be sticky and to get shared and to, like you said, inspire action because action is, at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do is to inspire people to take action.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you mentioned earlier when we chatted that you think thought leadership is a misunderstood term. Why did you say that?
I mean, again, like you, we've been around for a long time. I always hear people talking about it so differently. Like I hear people say, "I publish a blog post. Look at me. I'm a thought leader." But I think that, and I think it's interesting. So this study's a few years old, but right before the pandemic started, I did a study with Andy Crestodina from Orbit Media and with SurveyMonkey, and we set out to really understand how do marketers understand thought leadership. And again, the data's old, but it was so interesting because we asked questions like, which qualities are essential versus nice to have in thought leadership? Or can a brand be a thought leader, or does it need to be a person? Or things like, does a thought leader need to have an active audience or a large audience? And it was very interesting because in those results, we saw there was very little I mean, there are definitely trends what people believe thought leadership to be, but in so many of those questions, like there was a very mixed bag. You know, even if you ask marketers what thought leadership was, it was all over the board. So I just don't think as an industry we've done a really good job defining thought leadership. And I think also people who are doing thought leadership kind of define it the way that they can actually deliver it. So, so it just makes sense. But um used from our data, it's not really clear to marketers what thought leadership is.
I was reading your report when I was preparing for this interview, and there was one stat that stuck out to me as interesting. So you said, well, you found that 71% of marketers consider purely educational content to be thought leadership. I was just curious, what are your thoughts on that stat?
I'm of such a mixed mind on that stat, to be totally honest with you. I think in general, it is difficult for purely educational how-to content to be thought leadership because I think so much of that already exists. But I think if you are educating people on how to do something that they don't already know how to do, or you're educating them in a way that's different than others have done so they can do it better, faster, easier, whatever that thing is, I think that can be thought leadership. So in short, I think it can be, but I think the vast majority of how-to content isn't thought leadership.
Hmm. That's interesting you say that. We're pretty similar in terms of our thinking. There was another good report on thought leadership I came across a few months ago, and it essentially found it was looking at people's answers and kind of bucketing them into categories and then labeling them. So these people are your skeptics, and here are some common characteristics of people who are skeptical of the term thought leadership. And then there are some people who are really open to this, and these are the people that probably on LinkedIn. They will follow someone for a while. They'll learn a lot from this person, even if this person is simply sharing educational best practices, and they'll start to see this person and call this person a thought leader. So it's not that good educational content delivered consistently across time cannot, earn you the title or your company the title of, an authority, a thought leader. It for sure can. It's just that among certain populations, thought leadership needs to be much more than that. So it really comes down to who are you speaking to? Who's your audience? What's their level of education? What's their level or their years of experience? How skeptical are they? How open are they? And that's really, at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to who is the person who's reading your content or watching your
Absolutely.
content or listening to your content.
And also I would say too, like, again, just looking at content marketing, because it's an easy thing, because we all are also familiar with that. I mean, thousands and thousands of us have written how-to content for content marketing. There are
Mm-hmm.
such a very, very small number of people I would consider thought leaders in this space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny in that study I mentioned, so I did it with Andy Crestodina, and he at the time, he might have changed his viewpoint since, did not think educational how-to content was thought leadership. But it's funny because I consider Andy to be a thought leader, and he's very much rooted in educational how-to content. But
See,
it's the
there you
way
go.
that he shares it, you get the, "Oh, now I actually get it." So
Yeah.
I would definitely consider him like, that top 1% of content marketing, educational how-to writers who I actually consider to be a thought leader.
And the Orbit Media blog is wonderful for anyone listening who wants to follow along and learn about good content marketing practices. I think that's one of the better blogs to read.
I do too. Or Andy's book, Content Chemistry, is a great one too.
Pick it up, everyone. We're not affiliates. We just love it. So, moving on to talking about reports and what kind of companies should be producing reports, because I know you and I also agree that not every single company should be producing reports. So, when you think about characteristics that make a company a good fit to produce a research report, what are some of the characteristics? Like, what type of companies should produce reports?
So to me, it comes down to type of company, but it also comes down to goals. So I love to talk about both of those because I think you need to, think of that Venn diagram. You need to be in the middle. When you think about companies, I honestly think that most companies can benefit from original research. So for instance, when I started Mantis Research, we had zero list, we had no, obviously with zero visibility. One of the ways when we started Mantis Research that we built our brand was that we collaborated with BuzzSumo and we created a state of original research. So we were a very net new brand with nothing, but having that one piece of research really helped put us on the map. A lot of times we would get calls in and it's because people have actually seen that research.
That's awesome.
Um, Quite frankly, that was a play I took out of the CMI playbook. They did the exact same thing when they launched CMI. I work with other clients who are net new who have created research to launch their business. It works great.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's, companies who are, further down their path and they can really get really valuable insights and really valuable meaning out of doing research too. So I honestly think it can work for any size company, but I think the temperament of the company and what they want to do, I think that's where that key difference really is.
When you say what they want to do and the temperament, what exactly
Yeah.
do you mean by that?
So I am a very big believer that when you do survey-based research, it should be rooted in curiosity. It should be, like I mentioned, it should really be focused on trying to be relentlessly helpful to your audience. There are some companies who want to do research to prove the value of what they actually sell. I know some people think that this is a fine way to do research. For me, it's not. If you want to prove what you're doing, I say invest in case studies and testimonials and things of that nature. Research isn't your place to do it because people can see right through it. I also think companies need to be open to whatever the results are. So you're going to do research and you're going to be like, I know we're going to find this. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. So I'm
Yep.
a very big believer of the data is what the data shows. And there might be reasons why it might not be as accurate as you think or whatever those things are. But I don't try to hide those stories. Instead, I'm very transparent and say, this is what we found. Here's what we think. So companies that are trying to craft their narrative prior to putting the research report together, I think it's just not a very good fit. And the other big thing I would say is I talk to a lot of companies who want to do research, but they don't have access to the audience they want to survey. So you can either survey your own list, you can partner with another organization who has access to your list, or you can use survey panels, which I know you and I have both done to get responses.
Yep. Hmm.
And survey panels can work really well. I mean, that's a whole other conversation for another day, but you can't always just say, I want, 500, XYZ, IT pros who specialize in this, who live in the Midwest. I mean, that's a bad example, but you get my point. Some people think you
Yeah.
can just order up the exact people who you want to survey, but that's not always possible. And it's especially difficult with higher level audiences. So if you can't find a large group of people to survey, I think it's better to do a qualitative study, a smaller focus group, and really dig in there.
Hmm. Oh my God, where do I begin? You have so many good points, but you were just starting to say something else, so I'll let you
And I thought
finish.
one last thing I thought about too. Surveys also work really, really well if people who take surveys want to be able to answer survey questions quickly and easily. If you are
Yes.
asking questions that are nuanced or you're looking for these really, deep insights, or if it's a lot of inside baseball, chances are surveys are not your place either. I read a lot of surveys. I have a big swipe file of things not to do and things to do. But when you're using all of these inside baseball marketing jargon terms,
Mm.
chances are you're going to be better off doing smaller focus groups than you are going to be doing surveys. Just because I feel like when you get too nuanced, that's not the right format for surveys.
And if you do a small focus group, could you publish that? Or do you feel like you need to have a certain quantity of responses so that the data is statistically valid? Can you publish it as valid data? Or are you publishing it more as, hey, we did this focus group and here's what we found?
So I think you absolutely can publish it. I was working with a client. This was not their study. Anyway, there was a study in the multifamily industry, and it was called 20 for 20 or something like that. And they interviewed 20 people in the multifamily industry, or I'm sorry, the multifamily leasing industry. And then they shared all of those insights. And they've done that
Mhm.
every single year. And that is their trends report. So, I mean, they're very transparent. It's 20 people. Here's what we're learning. But
Yep.
I think it can work really, really well.
It's still interesting content, right? So even if it's not 200, 2,000 people, it's still interesting to learn what people in your ICP or people that do the same job as you or people that are going to hire you have to say. And that's another
Yes.
interesting learning. This is kind of off the cuff, but it's interesting as you start to experiment with conducting surveys with an audience. One thing you might learn is the audience you thought you were going to survey doesn't give you the best results. So, for example, we had at one company, we had a partner audience. We were trying to attract more partners to sign on to sell the software. So we were like, oh, we're going to survey other partners and try to share best practices. And this is what successful partners are doing in this space. It did all right. Like the report did okay. The next year, we tried a different approach. We said, this is what CEOs and C-level executives want from consultants in this space. Holy crap. It was like night and day. The survey was like fire, and we got leads and revenue from it for literally a couple years. It was pretty wild.
Wow.
So I would say it's another good thing. Like, try different audiences. Don't just automatically do the same survey every year because you want to do like an annual survey of the same audience. Like, experiment, and you might find that different audiences provide different insights and different results for the business.
Absolutely. I think there's confusion. Sometimes people think, we always talk about who is the audience for the findings and who is the person who has to take the survey. And
Hmm.
sometimes people conflate those two things, but really they truly can be very different people.
Yeah.
Or survey two audiences and compare their results. That like showing that gap is also really interesting too.
I do that a lot. I love to show, especially with the kind of companies I work with and working a lot in HR and human capital management space, showing the disconnect between senior leaders and employees,
Mhm.
like boots on the ground, can be really interesting. And there's almost always a disconnect.
My experience too, always. And the senior leaders are always more aspirationally like, we're great. And the employees are like,
Right.
always.
I want to back up before I move forward. Something that you said that was interesting to me. Well, just so everyone knows that's listening, I've always said Michelle and I are like yin and yang. We have so much in common, and we both produce surveys and get good results, but we approach things differently and think about things differently. So we both love doing surveys. Michelle prefers to survey a list. I prefer to survey a cold audience through a vendor, but we both do it both ways depending on the unique situation. I'm not always going to survey an audience. I might want to survey my list for a specific reason. For example, one report that I read every year is Superpath, and that's a community for content marketers, and they do a content marketing survey every year. They have an engaged email list. It's very easy for them to get people to fill out the survey. So that's like a great example. At my last job, we had a very specific software, and we wanted to understand how different behavioral types responded to remote work. So, for example, I was this behavioral type called an altruist, which means I'm not super dominant. I'm slightly more, I don't want to say passive, but not like as dominant. I'm not going to like steamroll you. I'm accommodating. I'm slightly extroverted, but not a ton. I'm not like Miss Sunshine walk into a party and like do a dance on the dance floor. So essentially, all these different behavioral drives combine to give you a behavioral pattern. And we really wanted to understand how each behavioral pattern responds to remote work. So we chose to survey our list, and it was really freaking interesting because most companies were talking about remote work preferences, but they didn't have anything to differentiate their report from the other thousands of reports. So in cases like that, surveying your list can be really smart to put out a really unique story. At the same time, you talked about inside baseball. Surveying your list can kind of help with that. Because if it's your list and you're talking about these terms, or they might be in the same industry, in the same space, they understand that inside baseball. They know the terms. Whereas if you're surveying some cold audience and you are, a conversation intelligence tool and you have a ton of clients in tech, but it's really hard to get this quantity of senior leaders in tech companies with at least 1,000 employees. So you're opening up the aperture. You're like, yeah, we'll also survey people in construction and people in finance. And like you said, you're trying to kind of ask these questions and they're not going to know what the hell you're talking about unless you're extremely explicit. And then the survey becomes very complicated. So it gets tricky. So it's kind of that fine line between what story are you trying to tell? Like, do you want to talk about behavioral groups within a certain, industry? Maybe you want to survey your list. Or can you have the questions be applicable to survey takers that might not fit your little perfect subset of guests or survey takers? Then yeah, you can definitely purchase an audience.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of pros and cons to both. But to your point, even just to say it one more time, because I think it's so important, people who answer surveys for panels typically are not remotely thinking about your topic as deeply as you are. So
True.
keep it simple, because they're incentivized to finish the survey, but not necessarily to think deeply. For your audience, they care about what they're going to get back, because they want to learn from their peers. They're going to spend some more time.
And it's really obvious that that's true, because one thing I like to do is ask some open-ended questions in a survey. And if you ask, 200 people to take some multiple choice questions, and then you're asking them to fill in an open response question, you're going to probably notice that a lot of those people are like, I don't know, or they give you a one-word answer. Like, you can definitely go through and throw those responses out because you know that these people aren't taking this seriously. But then you do get some really thoughtful responses and people that spend some time sharing their thoughts. And those are really the people you want to pay attention to, because those are the ones that probably identify with the topic the most.
Absolutely. And I, without question, have found when I have used lists to get survey responses, the open ends are far more thoughtful than with panels. I only use open ends and panels for data cleaning, not for thoughtfulness, to be totally
Exactly,
honest. Because
because
there's nothing that is really thoughtful. I just use it as a test of like, do they even understand this topic?
Yes. And when we say data cleaning, that just means you're throwing out the bad responses. So there's all different ways that you can program a survey so that you're catching these people who don't give a shit and they're just phoning it in. For example, you're asking them 20 questions and they finish the survey in 30 seconds. Like, definitely throw out that response. Or you're asking an open-ended question and they're like, I don't care, I don't know. Throw that out. Do not pay attention to the rest of their answers, because it's going to totally throw off your validity.
I'm going to throw out one question. We could talk about data cleaning all day too, but one question that Tony Cheevers from Research Stories shared with me, and you and I both know Tony. He's a
Yeah.
great resource when it comes to research. But one of the questions they ask as an attention check question is, what word do you associate with honesty? And they use things
Mm,
like ozone, truth, house, student, let's say. And bots can't, there's no way for a bot to know what that right answer is.
right.
So I think that's a really smart attention check question, or those types of questions that look at an association, because you can really tell if someone's paying attention.
Yeah, definitely. They are a good partner, and I will include a link to their site in the show notes for anyone who's interested. They do have a lot of good reports about writing reports. It's very meta. So I'll include some links. I'll also include the link to the report that you're referencing, Michelle, that you helped Orbit Media to create. So
Yeah,
anyone
again,
that's
very old,
listening,
so I wouldn't
doesn't
put too much
matter.
stake in it, but
No. I disagree. I think it's really good to have lots of examples. Even if they are 3 years old, it's still an example of how you create a report and how you ask questions. So I think that it's still definitely worth taking a look at.
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about some common questions we get when it comes to research reports. Okay, so we already covered the first one, which is how do I find an audience to survey? We already touched on that. Survey your list, get a panel. You can even look at your existing, market research data that perhaps your product team has conducted. You can look at your product data. So that's user data. Like, hey, we noticed that X% of our users do this and get these results, right? So that's all different ways to get this data that you can then write about in a report. The
Erin, can I
next
ask
question.
sorry, can I add
Oh,
one last thing, Erin?
of
Just
course.
because I just wanna make sure people, I said this really quickly, but I think it's a useful way, is to partner with someone. So I know back in the day, CMI, and they still do this, they always partner with marketing profs, because marketing profs had a much bigger list than they did back in the day. When I had done this, I've worked with BuzzSumo. So that's a great way. It's easy. If you can find the right partner, it's
Yeah.
a very inexpensive way to get people who are gonna be thoughtful, and then in exchange, you can always give them the survey results back just for their list so they can
Yeah.
see how their own audience answers those questions. So, I think that is actually if you don't have your own list, that is my preferred way to do it.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. That's such a good point because a lot of people don't have an engaged or a large list. And that's a really smart way to do it and how it can work out sometimes. Even if you don't have a huge budget, you can say, hey, if you're willing to give me this list, I'll do all the work. We'll create the report and then we'll give it to you. We'll co brand it, put your logo on it. And a lot of people are willing to say yes because they're like, cool, reports are expensive. I'm going to get this report essentially for free, right? So a lot of people tend to be open to that if, like you said, you're a good partner.
Exactly. And it's nice too, like when we did ours with BuzzSumo, I guarantee you people were finding our name and our report on BuzzSumo's website, not on ours. So
Right.
it's a great way to get additional visibility, in a really easy way.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. That's a good point. The second question I get a lot is how long does it take to create a report? And we were laughing before this call about sometimes we get people reaching out like, hey, I want to create a report. I'd like it to go live at the end of next month. And we're like, let's see about that. So, what would you say people should plan when it comes to end report creation?
Yes. So I'm going to say it depends. If you work with someone who does these reports and does this research, you're probably going to be able to move faster. If you are doing this on your own, which is completely fine and completely valid, I would give yourself more time than you think that you need, because there's a lot of different steps. So that said, what I think that in general, I would give yourself about a month, the first month. This is put together your strategy. What are you going to study? What questions do you want to answer? This gives you time to put together your actual survey questions, to get feedback from the team, to program your survey, to test it, and to finalize it. So in general, a month is a relatively comfortable time frame to do that. The next part of the process is all around getting responses. If you use a panel, depending on who you want to reach, it could be anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. If you're using your list, it might take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month plus. So that's going to be very variable depending on what your situation is. And then from there, you need to clean the data and analyze all of the results. I say give yourself about a week to do that, and then you need to write your report. So that one's, again, I feel like a lot of people have a lot more clarity on how long that takes, and that's going to vary very much by individual organization. I usually write the report in a week, then we have another week for revisions and so forth, and then it moves into the design stage. So in general, I would say give yourself at least 3 months. It could be a little shorter, a little longer, depending on how your team works.
Yeah, we're aligned there. I usually think about it. So I have, the different pieces. There's lots of different sections, but if I had to bucket it, I bucket into three major components. Number one is, like you said, the strategy, the planning, the survey design, writing the questions, and getting those responses back, whether it's from your list or not. That's like a month, sometimes more, if you're waiting for responses. Then I give a whole other month for the actual creation. And that would be writing the outline, making sure the outline looks good, writing the first draft, getting feedback, writing the final draft, designing it. You want to 100% give plenty of time for design because the design of a report is so important. The graphics and the charts are so important. You need to proof those, not just proof the copy. You need to proof the charts to make sure that the data insights are reflected properly. Is there a better type of graphic, a better style of chart that we could use to help readers really wrap their heads around these data points? So for me, that whole part is a whole month. Then the last month, at least, would be preparing to launch this report. So putting together all your plans. And this is something as simple as uploading. If you're going to have a PDF and people are going to be able to download it, you need to build the web page. You need to upload the PDF. You need to test it. You need to test your email responder. If you're going to send people an email and you're also going to email this PDF to them, is it working? Make sure you leave yourself plenty of time to test that. I've made the mistake in the past of testing it the night before, and it ended up being like a huge stress and everyone was up to like midnight. Don't do that. Like, get this ready with plenty of time. What's your launch plan? Are you going to have like a LinkedIn takeover? How are you going to distribute it? Are you going to have a press release? What is it going to do to make a big splash day of? Like, that takes a whole month just to plan all of that in most cases. So I also say 90 days is a good buffer. And most of the time it ends up taking a little bit longer because things always come up. Everyone's busy.
Yes. And a couple of things to that, Erin, if you don't mind me just interjecting a
Oh,
few points.
please.
The one thing I would say about design, so typically what happens, either my client writes the report or I write the report. I only design about one or two reports per year with my designer, not myself. This is what I will say, do not do, because I've seen clients do this time and time and time again. They write the report and they throw it over the wall to the designer and say, okay, here you go. That does not work well. It should be very much a collaborative effort. So we actually, when I work with clients, we do a design story finding call when the survey's actually fielding. And we decide as a team, okay, this is what the report is going to look like. We look at different samples. We plan out for every chart, here's what it's going to look like. It's going to include a headline and the question and the data. And then, so that way we have the whole structure. So when we write the report, we're all on the same page. And then when the report is ready, we actually go through with the designer and look at every single chart and say, okay, this chart should be a bar chart. This chart should be a donut chart. And we have a lot of different samples to pull from so that there's not too many different types of data or too many different types of data viz, but it's not just bar chart, bar chart, bar chart.
Yeah.
So I think, long story short, just be very collaborative with your designer, and you can start planning that prior to the data being done. That will really accelerate your process.
For sure. And just so listeners know, when she says data viz, she just means data visualization. And there are courses on this. If you have an in-house designer who's a fabulous designer, but just doesn't have experience with data visualization, there are lots of courses that you could purchase for that person as a gift and as a professional development opportunity. Something that we did with one of the designers on my team at my last job is she was very happy and very grateful to learn all these new skills to expand her resume and toolkit as a designer. So just to say, like, don't throw them to the wolves, give them support and the training they need, because it's not easy. I mean, coming up with charts, it's definitely a new skill set. For me, it definitely was to think about how to, and I'm not a designer, I don't do any design myself either, but just me as a creative being able to wrap my head, especially when you're cross-tabulating data and you're trying to show, okay, so all the people who said yes to this question, here's these findings. Like they also said this. And that can be really complicated and very hard to show visually.
It definitely can be. And even just a really simple idea too is to have a swipe file of data viz that you like so that
Yeah.
you can then use it with your designer to say, okay, let's make it look like this, or this is our inspiration. And that seems like that's been really helpful too.
Oh, yeah.
And
I
it
love
eases
your
the
swipe
process.
file. I have seen
Hmm.
Michelle's swipe file. It's epic. It's great. So I think that's a great bit of advice that anyone that's listening can take away. All right. So the next question that I hear a lot, I don't know the first thing about survey design or writing survey questions that will give a good story. How do I go about that?
So I'm actually saying I'm really glad that people are asking that question.
Yeah.
So many times I hear people say, oh, it's easy. I'll just write some survey questions and get responses and so forth. And those people are definitely underthinking it. So what I recommend is that you are always trying to think about how can my survey provide insights? How can it tell a story? Instead of let me just collect as much information about my industry as possible and sharing it.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but just as a quick example, like a lot of times people want to look at budget. How much are you spending? Which is a question I actually do not love because it's so variable. Or even is your budget going to be increasing or decreasing? So people share those data points out there, but there's not really anything to do. Like you share it and then your story is kind of done. So I always recommend that people think about how they can ask survey questions that are going to, uncover gaps, or they're going to, find these disconnects in the story, or they're going to like look at these different, segment comparisons. So there's a lot of different ways to go about thinking about story. I'm more than happy to share examples if that would be helpful. But think about how to ask questions like that share a story, and then two, think about what is the overarching story that you want to tell. So for that, I always ask clients, what are the big picture questions? Let me back up. I don't ask clients. I always recommend once we put together the actual strategy, I say, from what I hear, these are the big picture questions that your survey wants to answer. And these are not survey questions, but these are the big ideas. So if your research answers these questions, you're going to think that your research is successful. Get buy-in on what those questions are so everyone understands scope, and then create survey questions to answer those actual questions. So you know that you're actually going to find something meaningful. It might not be what you think, but you're going to be answering meaningful questions.
Yeah, and I would love if you can think of one. I know it's sometimes really hard to think of concrete examples on the fly, but if you happen to be able to whip up an example of what is a good survey question versus what is a poor survey question, I love to hear it.
Absolutely. I am happy to share ideas. I have so many survey questions that I can point to. As a really simple example, here's a question. So I do a study every year with UiPath, and we seek to understand how satisfied RPA developers are in their profession. So one of the questions that we ask is, how important are each of these things in your career? And we talk about salary, leadership trusts me to do my job, flexibility to work from where I want, so on and so forth. So that in and of itself is very much an inventory question. It just says, okay, this is how important things are. To make it into a story, we ask the follow-up question, how satisfied are you in each of these areas? And
Hmm.
then we'll see this gap between this is where people this is the importance, but this is actually the satisfaction. And that is a really interesting story.
That's a great
Um,
example.
I'll give you one other quick example because I think it's very easy to implement. This is a question I've asked years in marketing profs survey. So we look at marketing training, B2B marketing training. Which of these things does your marketing training have? And what would you like it to have, or what is not important? So it's things like examples and templates and checklists and frameworks. And what we see is that there's a small percentage that says that my training has this. Tons of people say, I want my training to have this. And most people, there's a very small percentage that will say this is not important to me. So if we had just said, what do you want your training to have? It would not be that interesting, but seeing that gap, that's the actual story. So oftentimes it's just asking a follow-up question to like show that disconnect or that gap and so forth.
Yeah, I love that. And to build on to that, also asking this to two different audiences. So asking one audience, hey, I did a coaching report in the past for one company. It's like a coaching software. And we were like, hey, what are some things that you wish your company provided to you in terms of coaching? I want to get coached on hard skills, soft skills, blah, 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 whatever it was. And then we asked essentially the same question to leaders. We just phrased it like, what does your workforce, like, what's most important to your workforce in terms of coaching? And we were able to show a huge disconnect. Like senior leaders thought that people wanted to be coached on this, but really the people on the ground who are receiving the coaching don't. They want to be coached on something different. And that's a really interesting story.
Yeah, there's a lot of really easy things to just easily make changes in your survey to make that story just really, really pop.
Yeah.
That's a great example, Erin.
And thanks, Michelle. It's really hard to write good questions, right? It's time consuming. I was telling you before this call, I'm actually working on 3 reports in Q1 and at all different stages of completion. And just yesterday, I was writing questions for one of the reports and it took 8 hours. I literally sat there for 8 hours making sure my questions were really good. Because if you phone it in and try to hurry through it, guess what? Your story is probably going to suck. So I'd say writing your questions is an important skill set. And I believe that you actually recently launched a course specifically about that. Is that right?
I do. I have a course. So I have two things that are going to help people because I'm a very big believer. If you have a low budget, which is fine, if you're going to get help in one section, it's creating great survey questions. Because I've had a lot of people come and say, "Oh, I didn't ask this question correctly. Like, what do I do now?" And if the surveys feel that it's honestly too late, you can't fix a broken survey. So I firmly believe to get help with your survey design. So I offer a course called the Build a Better Survey, where you can learn the fundamentals of choosing your survey topic all the way down to, the story you want to tell, creating questions to focus on story, and then adding quality questions to, for that data cleaning. And then I also offer a survey review service. So if you just want a second set of eyes on your survey, which I would highly recommend, even if it's not me, just have other people look at your survey. That's something else I'm offering too, because it's so easy to make unintentional mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you haven't done surveys before. I have a huge swipe file of things that you shouldn't do. And I know I've made many mistakes in the past too. So both of those things might help if you're doing research on your own.
Awesome. Definitely take advantage of that because if you don't have an internal, like PhD data scientist who can actually review the way you're asking the questions, you need someone else to do it. Don't trust yourself if you're not, trained in survey design. I don't trust myself. I write the questions. I, do my due diligence the best I can, and then I pass them off to someone far more qualified to me to do the review because that's a very specialized skill set. So I really agree that that's important.
And really quickly, I would even add, even if you had a PhD, people either look at data from like a very nitty data science perspective, hugely helpful, or you look at it how to ask questions to tell stories.
Mm.
And I think you need both. So you need the PhD, but you also need the eye on story too.
You need the yin and the yang,
The
the
yin and the
marketing,
yang.
creative storytelling brain, and the person who's going to keep you honest as a marketer
Exactly.
writing a survey
Exactly.
there's always some kind of agenda. You can definitely try to minimize it as much as possible, but at the end of the day, a company is not producing a report for fun. A company is producing a report to reach a goal, whatever that goal may be, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Michelle's nodding. Yes.
I'm sorry, I
yes,
was nodding. I'm like, that's absolutely true. People always have very specific goals.
Yeah. All right. Last question that I get a lot. Okay. Sounds like there's a lot of moving pieces. How do I keep everyone on track without losing my mind? Do you have any tips for this?
Lots. Have a great project plan. I know your course has a really great project plan in it. So if people haven't taken your course, I highly recommend that. I think it's just having the process written down. And one thing I do think is really useful is I do have something called a story map. And this doesn't exactly answer your question of how do you keep all those pieces and parts together, but it's kind of my one source of truth with the survey. But it's a simple spreadsheet. You list all of the questions, not the options. And then in this, you talk about, okay, this question is served to this audience versus this audience. And this is the survey logic that we want to have in this question. And this is the crosstab that we want to run and so forth. So just having all your questions in one simple spreadsheet can be very helpful. And if your survey is too long and you need to cut, also very helpful to see all those questions in one spot and people
Mm.
can decide, you know what? Yeah, this question we don't need and so forth.
Speaking of your survey being too long, let's say that you do end up asking 20 questions and then you don't want to put them all in the report because the report would be unwieldy, would be too long to consume. Just so people know, those don't have to go to waste. You can actually publish those as blog posts, or you could talk about them on a podcast. You can put those data insights out as separate content. It doesn't have to be that every question you asked has to make it into your report or it's never going to see the light of day. So there's actually a lot of times what I do is I'll find like the findings that tell the best story together, and then I'll reserve the rest. I might stick them in the appendix. Like, here's some other findings. We're not going to take the time to story tell, but they're here if you're interested. And then those become part of the editorial plan and the editorial calendar.
And I would actually take it even a step further and recommend that your findings don't include everything. Because when
Yeah.
you look at your findings, you're going to see, look at how these two groups compare. Look, you're going to see so many stories. And if you're trying to share every single story in this one report, it's going to be very dissonant to your reader.
Yeah.
So pick one narrative, tell that story, and then know you have tons of other content that you can tell from that. I actually did my fall presentation on how to create a year's worth of content from let me say that again. I actually did my fall conference presentation on how to create a year's worth of content from one research study. So don't think one and done. Think of that as your initial piece and jump off from there.
100%. If you're spending all that time and effort and budget into creating a report, don't just do the one report. It's literally the easiest way to get content for months and months and months. So that's why,
Yes.
I freaking love reports so much. And I'm glad that we share that love and we're able to help others learn how to create their first reports because they're just so great.
They are.
So, Michele, we're up on time. If you were to leave listeners with one tip, it can be about anything. What would you like to tell them?
I know you and I have talked about this a lot. At least for me, burnout is real. Anyone who's creating research reports, thought leadership, content, burnout is very, very real. I've worked on my own since 2008. So what I love to do is to think about my work in seasons. So I have a fall season where I put my head down, work with a bunch of different clients. I take time off for the holidays. I have my winter and spring season. Actually, I have a winter season. I have kids until their spring break. Put my head down, take a break. I have my spring season, from spring break to the end of their school year. And then I take a break. So I don't know, for me to get to know, to give myself grace to take more breaks, I can work harder and I'm a lot more refreshed in those times when I'm actually working.
That's
So
such
don't
great
don't feel like you have
advice.
to be constantly on. I think it's exhausting.
And especially as, a business owner, anyone that's listening, it's like a scarcity mindset. If I don't say yes to every single opportunity that comes my way, what if there's no more opportunities? And I definitely have experienced that myself. But, one of my big goals for this year, which I talked about in my newsletter, is not working my fingers to the bone, like giving myself time. So I actually in April, I carved out time. So I'm only working with one client, which is my long-term client. I'm not taking any other projects, so I can have some time to spend with my kids. Again, I'd like to work on my course. I know that you're talking about taking some time to work on courses more this year. Me too. And that's really important because in this kind of field, especially working with complex topics, working with data, it's really like cerebral and nerdy, and it just really takes a lot of your energy and focus. It's not like you're writing about nail polish and all these like nice, easy things. It's totally different, and you really have to recharge. Last note with thought leadership, one of the best ways to create thought leadership is to carve out time to think because you have to be having thoughts to come up with good stories. So I would say, please listen to Michele. Try to give yourself enough time off. I'm listening to Michele. I'm doing it. And I hope that you all give yourself time to rest, recuperate, and think. And that's it for today. So thank you so much for listening. Thanks, Michele, for coming on.
Thanks so much, Erin.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Notorious Thought Leader. If you're looking for more stories from marketers who are generating demand from thought leadership, then visit us at motionagency.io/notorious. See you next time.